Out here to make a record, you dumb cracker. They broadcast me out on the radio.
Joey Clark.
Welcome to the final hour. It's a little show we call News and Views. We're just a local talk show, folks. But you can now find us online at the X platform, my account at the Joey Clark on X, Twitter, whatever you're calling it, and Joey Clark Live on YouTube. Be sure to like and subscribe. Share it with your friends if you like the show or even if you hate the show. Isn't it a wonderful free country we live in? Now, over the weekend, I started getting into a biography about Benjamin Franklin and hearing discussions about old Ben Franklin. And if you go to Franklin's autobiography at one point, and he did this throughout his life, he'd come up with little aphorisms or ways of going after virtue. And he'd take each virtue and he would pursue that particular one till he felt he perfected it. Then he would move on to the next. He thought each of the virtues built on one another, but his final virtue, after becoming such a moral man, number 13, lucky number 13, humility. But then Franklin writes something that I think is a little bit ironic. At least that's how I read it. I chuckle when I read this. The 13th virtue, humility. Imitate Jesus and Socrates. You know, folks, those who compare themselves to Jesus or Socrates tend not to be hailed for their humility. Yet it is true that the humble path is never obvious or literal, else any fool could stumble upon it with dumb luck. Only after plumbing the lowest depths is man free to rise to the highest places. Only in seeking the highest summit has man ever come to know how little he knows and how truly low he is. Humility is found in private surprise, often amid rejection by all too certain crowds and authorities alike. Jesus conquered death by willingly suffering the worst death imaginable. Socrates found wisdom by coming to know he knew nothing. Perhaps Ben Franklin is onto something with his suggestion to imitate the two. For like Franklin, the son of God and the father of philosophy were never quite what they seemed to the naked literal eye. There are two kinds of people, Christopher Hitchens writes. Those who read Franklin's celebrated autobiography with a solemn expression, and those who keep laughing out loud as they go along. Benjamin Franklin still leaves his modern readers guessing with both solemnity and mirth. Undoubtedly a man of his time, few epitomize revolutionary Enlightenment thought, innovation, and politics like Benjamin Franklin. He also managed to stand above and apart from his time. Franklin's approach to life seemed like the stuff of ancient wisdom, an 18th century Solon to Voltaire's Sophocles, yet his life and legacy continue to furnish the future with fresh interpretations and perspectives. Try as we may, we never quite have Franklin figured out. Nothing is obvious in him, especially his faith and morals. The famed deist always seemed to be winking at us. Indeed, Franklin's unwritten 14th virtue might as well have read irony. By emulating Mr. Franklin himself, one can act contrary to expectations. That brings me to one of Franklin's most famous proposals, one that speaks to our own confused and arrogant age, and one that still inspires debate about America's status as a Christian nation. The 1787 Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia was at an impasse. It was a hot June day, and passions inside the convention were beginning to boil over. The central question of representation in the proposed House and Senate remained a festering open sore. Would the votes in the Houses of Congress be apportioned according to population, or would each state have an equal say? The debate was growing so inflamed between large states and small states that it threatened to break up the convention. Enter old Ben Franklin, who decided to surprise the convention with an unexpectedly humble proposal. On June the 28th, 1787, Franklin gave this speech to the Constitutional Convention. Quote, Mr. President, the small progress we have made after 4 or 5 weeks' close attendance and continual reasonings with each other, our different sentiments on almost every question, several of the last producing as many noes as ayes, is methinks a melancholy proof of the imperfection of the human understanding. We indeed seem to feel our own want of political wisdom, since we have been running about in search of it. We have gone back to ancient history for models of government and examined the different forms of those republics which have been formed with the seeds of their own dissolution, now no longer exist. And we have viewed modern states all around Europe, but find none of their constitutions suitable to our circumstances. In this situation of this assembly, groping as it were in the dark to find political truth, and scarce able to distinguish it when presented to us, how has it happened, sir, that we have not hitherto once thought of a humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understandings? In the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this room for divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. All of us who were engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. To that kind of providence we owe this happy opportunity of consulting in peace on the means of establishing our future national felicity. And have we now forgotten that powerful friend? Or do we imagine that we no longer need his assistance? I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings that except the Lord build they labor in vain that build it. I firmly believe this, and also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel. We shall be divided by our little partial local interest. Our projects will be confounded, and we ourselves shall become a reproach and a byword down to future age. And what's worse, mankind may hereafter from this unfortunate instance despair of establishing governments by human wisdom, and leave it to chance, war, and conquest. I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessings on our deliberations be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business, and that one or more of the clergy of this city be requested to officiate in that service. After a sparse debate, after Franklin's speech, Franklin's proposal for daily prayer was eventually shelved and never passed. I believe Hamilton made the argument that, well, if we all of a sudden start doing prayer and giving it up to God and divine providence and protection in the middle of this convention, people will think there's something wrong with the convention, so we got to keep up appearances. Another guy rose up and said, well, we can't really afford to pay a member of the clergy to do that for us every day. And so it wasn't voted down. It was just tabled or shelved and never passed. Though ultimately rejected, Franklin's mere suggestion seemed like a gadfly to spur on his colleagues to later compromise. In reaction to his proposal being rejected, Franklin would write at the bottom of the copy of his speech, "The convention, except 3 or 4 persons, thought prayers unnecessary." What humility I find in that simple private surprise. One must wonder if Jesus or Socrates were ever so surprised.